Maggie Ma is a California native who grew up in the East Bay. Her passion for gardening was inspired by the blood orange, the Meyer lemon, and pomegranate trees that her dad grew. She's a food industry consultant and freelance writer, and she became a master gardener in 2020. So I'm going to turn it over to Maggie.
Thank you, Paula. Thanks very much. It's my pleasure to participate today in this great program. I know I'm really excited about getting my vegetables in the ground, especially my tomatoes. And I am excited to see what questions you're going to have. We always learn a lot from these questions ourselves. So I encourage you to submit them. We'll be pausing a couple times during the presentation so that we can answer the questions while the subject matter is fresh in our minds. We'll be pausing multiple times through the presentation. So my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Propp, who's our presenter today. And Jonathan was one of my teachers when I was trained as a master gardener. Jonathan has been a San Mateo, San Francisco County Master Gardener since 2008, which was one of the very first classes, I believe, when the program started in this county. He grew up on the East Coast, and he learned to love gardening from his great aunt Celia. And he was delighted to discover the Bay Area in 1987. He specializes in the growing of organic fruits and vegetables, and he is a self-professed weather nerd, and I can vouch for that because he knows all about microclimates and does a great class for the Master Gardener Training Program about our local microclimates. So you're going to learn a lot about where you live and what to expect and how it's going to influence your garden today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Jonathan.
Thank you, Maggie. And Maggie will be monitoring the chat for questions as we go along. So as you come up with questions, just put them in the chat window and Maggie will be monitoring that. We'll be breaking occasionally during the presentation to answer any questions that were entered there. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen and we'll get started. I did look at the results of the poll, and I noticed that there were about almost 20 people that didn't respond. And if that means that, are you guys seeing the poll in your Zoom view now? No. Okay, that's good. So if those of you didn't respond because none of the answers pertain to you, then that means you're outside of the San Francisco, San Mateo County area. And I think what I'm talking about will apply, but obviously the climate in wherever you are, if it's like Southern California or Central Valley or something like that, is going to be very different from here. So some of what we'll talk about won't apply to you. Looking at where people are from, I'm seeing a lot on the peninsula flatlands and some peninsula coast side in San Francisco. So that's all very much in our core territory. If you're in Santa Clara County, Alameda County, it's going to be reasonably similar. So I think you'll be good. So let's get started. This is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about soil first, then what, when, and where to plant, propagating, transplanting, caring for your plants. And then at the end, we'll cover a number of topics very, very quickly, like irrigation, pest control, and so forth. So in the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of valuable research on soil, and we've learned a lot about the complex web that is healthy soil. In particular, there are 3 microorganisms in the soil, bacteria, fungi. We tend to think of those things as bad because we get infections from them, but there are lots of good bacteria and fungi that live in the soil and interact with plant roots in beneficial ways. And we're learning that maintaining those microorganisms in the soil is very important. So even in just the 12 years or 14 years that I've been in the Master Gardeners, I've seen a real shift from kind of the traditional tilling, digging up the soil mentality to one of no-till, which means you don't dig it up and you just let it develop. So when we talk about caring for vegetables, think of it as growing soil rather than growing vegetables. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that growing vegetables and fruits, 90% of it is about your soil. So if you can get this, if you have good soil, you're going to have good plants. So think not in terms of growing plants, but growing soil. Now, when I talk about soil and growing vegetables here, I'm generally going to be talking about growing in raised beds. Okay. I know a lot of you are interested in container gardening. We will talk about that later. Obviously, for raised beds, you're bringing in soil. I'm sorry, for containers, you're bringing in soil, right? We don't generally have good soil in San Francisco and San Mateo counties. There are a few exceptions, like in Half Moon Bay. My brother-in-law farms in Half Moon Bay, and I am deeply envious of his soil. But for the most part, on the coast side, you have a lot of sand, which doesn't retain water, generally lacking in nutrients. On the bay side, on the other side of the Santa Cruz Mountains, we have very clay-like soils. So there you've got the opposite problem, where the water doesn't penetrate very well. It tends to get muddy and run off. And it's just generally very hard to work. It's also pretty alkaline soil, which means that you've got to do some pH adjustment in the soil. So the soil's hard to work with in our area. And as a result, most people are using raised beds when they grow vegetables. So when I'm talking about soil, I'm going to be talking about gardening in raised beds. So when we talk about feeding the soil, really the best thing you can do for your soil is to add compost. If you think about how nature creates soil, you've got nutrients that wash down from mountains and in rivers, and then in the floodplains of rivers, they spread out all these nutrients. And then there's the decaying of dead plants, right? So that's how nature builds soil. Plants die, they land on the ground, they decay, and all those nutrients go back into the soil. So what you're trying to do in your raised bed is kind of mimic the process of what nature does. So you're going to add nutrients and you're going to add compost, which is essentially, broken down plant matter. Okay. Now, when it comes to adding nutrients, fertilizers, we highly encourage using organic fertilizers. Why? Organic fertilizers feed the soil. They're ingested slowly by the plants. They have ingredients that actually build soil capacity. And also many of them contain the beneficial microorganisms, the bacteria and fungi that will help your plants. Commercial non-organic fertilizers are kind of like giving your plants cocaine. It's designed to give sort of a quick shot of nutrients to your plants so that perk up and look really green, and then you kind of lose all that benefit in a few days, and there's no benefit to the soil. So to feed your soil, you want to be adding organic compost, and you want to be adding organic fertilizers or organic nutrients, okay? Now, so what kind of compost? We do have the municipal compost that comes from mostly Recology in our area. And that's great, and it's free. You know, we've done some tests on that, and you know, there are sometimes issues with that compost. Not everyone is careful about what they put in their green bins, and so sometimes there are nasty things that come through that compost. If you're thinking about growing your own vegetables and you're doing it in a small area, like a raised bed, say 4 feet by 8 feet or something, I would say make the investment in buying good organic compost at your local garden store and using that instead of the free municipal compost. So as we approach the growing season now, and we'll talk about, you know, when to plant, this is the time to prepare your garden beds. So you're going to want to add a good solid 2 to 3 inches of compost there. Add an organic fertilizer if you need to be putting in some nutrients, and just turn it over lightly into the top few inches of soil. Okay. Then once you do that, you want to water the bed thoroughly and give it about a week or so to mix in there, have everything filter into the soil before you do your planting. So don't put the fertilizer in and plant right away. Put the compost and fertilizer in, mix it in with your soil, water it, let it sit for a week, and then you're going to be good to go. Now, my last point here is, after you've planted, add mulch on top. So what's the difference between compost and mulch? Compost is decayed plant matter that you mix into the soil. Mulch is something you put on top of the soil as a protective layer. So mulch does a couple things for you. One is it prevents weeds from growing by essentially covering the areas between plants. And the other is it reduces evaporation, which is really important in our summer times here. It can reduce evaporation as much as 50%, okay? Because it prevents the moisture in the soil from evaporating out in the daytime. There are a lot of different mulches you can use. One I like to use is straw. Half Moon Bay feed store, you can get straw bales. Similarly in Redwood City, I forget what it's called, Redwood City Feed and Fuel or something like that. They have rice straw bales. Remember, straw is different from hay. I've made this mistake once. Hay has seeds in it, straw doesn't. So if you plant hay, you're going to get like alfalfa sprouting up there. So use straw, and you know, wheat straw, rice straw, oat straw are all good mulches to put on top. They will break down over time and put some nutrients into the soil. Wood chips, just be aware that wood chips are going to be a little acidy. So as they break down, they're going to acidify your soil somewhat. So I prefer not to use wood chips on my vegetable beds. I'll use them elsewhere in my yard, but on my vegetable beds, I'm going to use straw. Okay, if you planted a cover crop, if you don't know what a cover crop is, don't worry about this, but a cover crop is plants you put in the bed over the winter to restore nutrients to the soil. And common ones are fava beans, crimson clover, etc. And if you did that, then don't pull them out okay? Because you don't want to disturb the soil. Just cut them off at soil level. You want to actually cut them into really as small pieces as you can so that they decay faster. So don't like leave the entire plant lying there on the soil. Chop it up into small pieces and let it sit there right on top of the soil. First of all, you'd be surprised at how quickly it's going to dry out and start to decay and filter into the soil. The roots are going to die with the stems cut off, and that'll just be more organic matter for your plants, okay? You can, if you want, if you're putting some compost and fertilizer on top of the bed and turning over the bed, no reason why you can't do that with your cover crop as well. So whether you need to add nutrients to your soil depends on what you grew there before, okay? If it's a brand new bed, I would certainly add some organic fertilizer to it to start. If it's an established bed, so for example, my raised beds have been around for 20 years and I've been working the soil for 20 years and I've got pretty good soil there. So unless I grew vegetables that were quote unquote heavy feeders the last summer, I'm not going to feel the need to add a lot of nutrients to them. So what are heavy feeders and light feeders? Well, heavy feeders refers to vegetables that remove a lot of nutrients from the soil while they're growing. They need a lot of nutrients. So if you look at the list of heavy feeders here, you're going to see that like most of your warm weather crops, your tomatoes, your cucumbers and squash and corn and those sorts of things, along with a lot of the cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, those are all heavy feeders. So if those were grown in your bed last summer, then you've depleted all the nutrients out of the bed, okay? And you're going to need to add nutrients this spring. Sometimes a lot of times I'll do it in the fall. Again, if you grew a cover crop in there, you have less need for adding nutrients because you've been adding nutrients through the cover crops. Light feeders are, just what you'd expect. They're vegetables that don't remove a lot of nutrients from the soil. So you don't have a real strong need to put nutrients back in there. Soil neutrals, what does that mean? Well, beans and peas are in the legume family. And one of the wonderful things about legumes are that they have nitrogen fixing bacteria on their stems. So sometime pull out a legume plant, look at the roots, and you'll see these little white nodules on the roots. And those are actually transferring nitrogen from the plant into the soil, which is why we grow things like fava beans as cover crops in the winter to put nitrogen in the soil. So legumes basically put as much nitrogen into the soil as they take out. And so for that reason, we call them soil neutrals, okay? So if you had a bed where you were growing beans, then you probably don't need to be adding nutrients for the next year. Another thing to think about as you're thinking about what you're going to plant in your garden bed is this idea of crop rotation. So if you plant the same crop family in the same location over and over again, you run the risk of building up soil-borne insect and pest diseases. So on this photo here is a tomato plant with what's called verticillium wilt, which is a terrible fungal disease that once it's in the soil, it's there for a decade. So you want to try to avoid that type of thing. So if possible, what you want to do is not plant vegetables from the same family in the same location year after year after year. So these are the families of vegetables, and tomatoes specifically are in the nightshade family here. So eggplant, tomato, pepper, potatoes. And if you've ever, looked at a potato plant, you've noticed the leaves are very similar to tomato leaves. So they're very closely related plants. So you want to try not to plant tomatoes in the same place year after year after year, okay? Another common family we grow are the cucurbits, which are cucumbers plus squash and pumpkins and melons. Another common family are the cruciferous vegetables, your broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, cabbage, etc. So you want to try to avoid planting vegetables from the same family in the same location over and over and over again. You want to try to rotate them around. However, how possible is that? A lot of us live, have small yards, and we don't have a lot of locations that we can rotate things around to. And I know in my case that I only have a few beds that get enough sunlight for my tomatoes every year. So I don't really have the luxury of rotating things around. So then what do? So one thing you can do is to plant disease-resistant varieties. And for tomatoes, they come with F1 for Fusarium wilt resistance or V1 verticillium wilt resistance. So you can plant those types of plants. Another thing you can do that I've done a lot of is kind of move my tomatoes into containers over the years. And then you're going to clean out your containers, which we'll talk about later, to prevent those diseases from building up there. We'll be having our Master Gardeners spring seedling sale in April. And we have a number of varieties which are going to be either Fusarium wilt or Verticillium wilt resistant there. Okay, let's break there. And Maggie, do we have any questions?
We do. We have quite a number of them, and
oh dear.
some great questions. So first of all, I wanted to let you know that we have someone who is joining us from Imperial County. That's part of the poll. So we have someone who's quite a distance.
Yeah.
And quite a different climate.
Yeah.
So what the first question I have is, this person attended a class that said that clearing out last year's soil from the raised beds is something that should be done. And this person is wondering if it's a big expense and doesn't seem quite, we have to throw out and buy new dirt to put into the raised beds. So they'd like to know what your recommendation is there.
Okay. Maggie, you're breaking up a little bit, so maybe go off video and that'll improve the audio.
Okay, we'll do that. I see I have a shaky internet connection for whatever reason. I don't know why. So anyway,
so
is that better?
Yeah, that's great. So first,
okay.
I don't agree with that. Unless you know for certain that there are, like if you had an outbreak of Fusarium or Verticillium wilt in a bed last summer, yes, then you would want to replace the soil. But if that didn't happen, it seems like a huge waste of soil, a huge expense, and furthermore, you're just starting from scratch, and I would much rather just put compost in and build up the soil.
That's kind of what nature does, right?
Yes.
Yeah, ideally.
Yeah.
So
okay. So the only caveat is if you know you have a soil-based disease in there, then for sure you need to replace that soil.
Okay. Another question about the raised bed that you show on the slide.
Mm-hmm.
people are wondering what it's made of. It looks very
Yeah.
thick. Like, is it concrete or perhaps gray wood? What is it?
So my beds are all redwood. So first of all, how to make a raised bed. Sunset Magazine always had great resources on things like this, and for many years, there was a site where Sunset basically said how to build a raised bed, and they gave you a list of materials and all the instructions for doing it. I'm pretty sure it's still out there. So just Google Sunset how to build a raised bed, and you should find that. Obviously, any wood you're putting in next to dirt needs to be rot resistant, okay? Which pretty much limits you to redwood or cedar. Unfortunately, both of those are expensive. Do not use pressure treated wood. So pressure treated wood is wood that has been injected with arsenic to prevent rot, to kill any insect pests that are going to get in there and cause the wood to rot. You don't want to be growing your vegetables next to that. So do not use pressure treated wood. If you want to use wood, it's pretty much redwood or cedar. And yes, they've gotten terribly expensive over the years. You're not restricted to wood, right? There are a lot of other materials you can use. Be aware that like anything metal is going to retain a lot of heat in the summer, and it's going to make your soil warmer. It's going to potentially burn your plants. So just be aware of that with metal. My brother-in-law did that, and I believe he said the metal's galvanized to prevent that from happening. So hopefully that helps.
Okay. Someone would like to know if they can use dried grass clippings as mulch.
Dried grass clippings as mulch. I probably wouldn't. I think if you have a compost pile, those dried grass clippings are great in the compost pile. We'll talk about composting later. They add nitrogen and help heat up your composting pile. But I would sort of worry about grass seeds getting in there, and pretty soon you're going to have a lot of grass growing in your beds. So I'd probably stay away from that.
Someone else would like to know if they can still plant a cover crop starting at the end of March. They have planted leafy greens in the beds, and while they're starting to bolt now, they want to harvest them. And then once they're harvested, do a cover crop. They want to know if it would be too late to do that prior to tomato planting.
Yes. Yes, the answer is yes, it is too late. So the time to do cover cropping is in the fall. I generally do it before the end of October. I put my fava beans into the ground then. That allows them to germinate when it's still pretty warm. They'll get up to a foot or so as the days get short, and they won't grow very much. And then as the days lengthen, they'll just explode, and they'll get up to like 3 feet high. So it is too late to do a cover crop. So just put some organic fertilizer in there.
Someone would like to know where kale would fall on the feeding requirement chart.
I
think it's cruciferous, right?
It is cruciferous.
Yeah.
I don't think kale's a huge feeder, to be honest. I mean, I've grown kale. And I don't think it's a huge feeder. Kale, by the way, is a wonderful crop. It's so easy to grow. It's so hardy. And it's one of those cold weather crops that actually survives hot weather pretty well.
Good to know. Someone else would like to know if there are weeds, should they be treated as a cover crop and left to decompose in the soil, or should they be pulled? They are the ones with lots of yellow flowers. I have a feeling I know which ones those are.
Get those puppies out of there as quick as you can.
Get them out. Sounds like Bermuda daisies.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll take over. Okay. When is the best time to plant potatoes? And is there a local source?
So
of potatoes?
we'll get there.
Okay.
We're going to get to planting calendars, I think, in the next section.
Great. In terms of crop rotation, how close to the same location counts as the same location?
Well, that's a great question. It depends on whether you're in raised beds or just, general a general field. If you're in raised beds, just like moving it to the next raised bed is fine. If you're in, a big field, I'd probably move it, 5 or 6 feet away.
Okay.
If you have that kind of space.
Okay. Someone else says, I have 2 raised beds and usually plant peas, carrots, zucchini, and little tomatoes. This year, I am putting tomatoes and zucchini in one bed and carrots and peas, I guess, in the other. Last year, I did the opposite. Is that okay? They do seem to grow well, although last year the tomato plant did badly, and I didn't get the crop I usually get with the zucchini.
Hey, the only way to learn anything is experimenting, right? I mean, and just try something new and see how it works and see what doesn't work. The problem is there's a lot of variables, right? And you can't you can't prove that the outcome you got was completely due to your switching plants and stuff, but just give it a try. We're going to talk a little bit about plant partnering later on as well.
Okay. Someone else would like to know how to prevent mildew on leaves of zucchini plants.
Let's get back to that later.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have quite a few questions that
when we talk about pest management, we'll talk about that.
Okay, sounds good. All right.
Should we get back into it?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So you're getting ready to plant, and the first question you run into is, do you want to do seeds or do you want to do seedlings? So, I've tried to summarize it here. Let's start with seedlings. Seedlings are easy. You say, hey, I want to plant some Swiss chard, and you just run down to the local garden store and buy some 6 packs of Swiss chard, and boom, you've got them planted the same day, right? The downside is, you'll pay $2.99 for a 6-pack of Swiss chard, whereas for $2.99, you'll get a whole seed pack for Swiss chard, and you can grow a lot more Swiss chard with that. So seedlings are more expensive. The varieties are limited to what the nurseries stock. So if there's a particular, and this is, the main reason that I would grow something from seed is if there's a particular variety that I like, that's just not commonly stocked in the garden stores, then my only choice is to plant it from seed. You're also a little bit at the mercy of the commercial nurseries and their quality in starting seedlings, right? So if it's gotten an unhealthy start, then it's just not going to be a healthy plant for you. Now, we're fortunate in this area. We've got some really good garden stores. The quality is not only good, but particularly in the last 10 years, the expansion of varieties of vegetables is very impressive, particularly the addition of heirloom varieties. And we'll talk about what an heirloom is in a second. So that's seedlings. So seeds just requires more planning, right? Because the seedling you buy in the store was planted a few weeks ago. Okay. So if you're planting seeds, you're just going to have that lag time of a few weeks. So you got to plan ahead more with seeds. If you're going to put something in the ground, you got to plant it in the ground, a few weeks before you expect to see anything of note coming out of the ground. Or we'll talk about this as well. For a lot of the things you're going to plant in the spring, for a lot of our warm weather vegetables, if you're going to start those from seed, it means you got to start them indoors, okay? Which is a whole other set of work. So planting from seeds just requires more planning. That's all it is. And I can say that over the years, I have, shifted away from seedlings to seeds as I've gotten more experienced at this, but also because I have sort of particular preferences with vegetables. Now, some vegetables need to be planted directly in your garden bed. Others can be transplanted in. So ones that must be sowed directly, if you look at what's consistent in this list, it's all the root crops, okay? So root crops just don't transplant well. So any root crop, you got to sow directly in the soil. Now, fortunately, most of these things, with the exception of potatoes, don't really require very warm soil to germinate. So, you could probably be planting them now. There's a whole bunch of things that have to be transplanted in. So a lot of your cruciferous vegetables here, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, etc. And then tomatoes and eggplants. And I would throw peppers into that list as well. So, and the reason for that is just that, you would need to sow them so early and our soil is just not warm enough for them to germinate. So you got to sow them indoors if you want to grow them from seed, and then transplant them later. Then there's a bunch of stuff that's in the happy middle. Let me say the legumes and the cucurbits, they're really easy to grow from seed. I've done it. I've germinated indoors. I've germinated outdoors. They're all big seeds. They germinate pretty easily. The leafy greens are a slightly different thing. They're very shallow rooted plants on the whole, with the exception of Swiss chard. Swiss chard, by the way, is a relative of beet. And if you look at a chard leaf and a beet leaf, they're really similar. And if you look at a chard root, it kind of looks like a slimmed down beet. So with the exception of chard, these are all very shallow rooted crops, and they're a little finicky transplanting, I find. And you don't want to transplant them too deep. So I tend to sow these directly in the soil, all these greens. And once your soil's warm enough, and even if it's not, they tend to germinate pretty quickly and pretty easily. Types of seeds. So, it's good to know the terminology. So first of all, what are hybrids? Hybrids are commercially bred seeds bred by university ag schools or by seed companies and patented, that are commercially designed for, disease resistance or production or whatever. A hybrid seed is, a hybrid plant is like a mule, right? A mule is a hybrid of a horse and a donkey. And if mules mated, you wouldn't get a mule, you get a horse or a donkey. Same thing happens with hybrid plants. So you can't reuse the seeds from hybrid plants because you're not going to get the same variety. Open pollinated plants are simply a naturally occurring variety. You can save the seeds from those and reuse them. You'll get the same variety year after year. heirlooms, you hear a lot about heirlooms. It's a subset of open pollinated seeds. They're generally ones with long pedigree, maybe 100, couple hundred or more years old. And why do people grow heirlooms? Well, they're generally going to be chosen because they've got better flavor, or some people do it just because they want to preserve a certain variety. Now, heirlooms, because they don't have this hybrid resistance, are inclined to be more susceptible to disease. So you take that risk with heirlooms. Now, I grow a lot of heirloom tomatoes because I like the flavor of those tomatoes. But that I do run the risk that those tomato plants are going to be more likely to get disease than a hybrid. If you go to a grocery store, you buy tomatoes, those are hybrid tomatoes, and they've been bred not only for vigor and disease resistance, but for shipping ability, right? and maybe for appearance. And a lot of heirlooms, quite frankly, are just ugly. And I find them ugly in kind of beautiful ways. Like there's a lot of weird looking winter squash out there in the heirloom category. And a lot of the heirloom tomatoes are just kind of ridged and weird, and they don't ship well, but they just taste great. And so a lot of people have gone back to are planting heirloom varieties because they like the flavor. At our spring garden sale, we will have a lot of varieties of heirloom tomatoes. So like I said, I'll typically plant from seed where I can't find something at the garden store, for example. And what I grow in my garden is very much driven by, obviously, what I like to eat, but also what I can't easily find elsewhere, okay? So if, like, let's just take arugula. I love arugula, but I can't even find it at the farmer's market very easily. Or if it is, it's really expensive. So I just grow my own. Similarly, Mizuna is a wonderful Japanese green that you're just not going to find in a farmer's market. So if you want it, you got to grow it yourself. This is a cucumber. It's a Japanese cucumber, which is long and skinny and very tender skin. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, seedlings of Suyo Long showed up in my local nursery. So I don't need to grow them from seed anymore, except that it's pretty easy to grow cucumbers from seed. These are a couple of heirloom pole beans. Even emerites I now see at the garden store in transplants. But again, as I said, their beans are just easy to grow from seed. And so forth and so on. So I tend to grow things that I can't find at the farmer's market. And all these tomatoes here, you're going to find at our spring seedling sale. Okay. If you do get seedlings, you want to avoid the temptation to buy the biggest thing. There's that temptation to see the basil plant that's, a foot high and say, hey, I'm just going to get more basil. Bear in mind that the root of a plant is roughly equivalent to like 1/2 to 2/3 the height of the plant. Okay. So when you see that really tall seedling, like the tomato on the left here or the basil on the right, just, do the visual in your head. And what you're going to see is the roots of that plant have hit the bottom of the pot and are starting to bend back in on itself. And when you transplant that thing, it's going to be next to impossible to untangle that and that plant's never going to sort of set good spreading roots. So you're actually much better off getting a transplant that's not too big for its pot. Okay, so like these specimens that I have down below. The other thing you want to look for is a good solid stem. Okay, if it's kind of skinny and leggy, that's not good. Okay, you want a good thick stem, right size for the pot I talked about, and dark green. That's just an indicator that it's not nutrient poor. Okay, if it's kind of yellowy, light green, then it's nutrient poor and you want to avoid that. Okay, so this is some really useful information that I found out there on soil temperatures for seed germination. So one of the best things you can do for yourself is to invest in a soil thermometer. $5 to $10, any garden store, get them online. It's a very simple thermometer with a short probe on it. You just stick that down in the soil, put it a couple inches down there to see what your soil temperature is. That's going to tell you, you know, what you can plant, okay, and when. Right now, my soil temperature is, you know, kind of in the 50s still. But as the days lengthen and warm up, that's going to go up quickly. So you can see here for these crops, I'm not going to go through the details. You all get this presentation, what the minimum temperature is, and you can see the optimum range is reasonably high for a lot of these vegetables, which is why sometimes we like to start them inside. But you know, a lot of your green leafy vegetables, like your lettuces, you can see that they all germinate just fine in cool temperatures. They could be going in now. Lettuce, mustard greens, Swiss chard, all those things can be going in now. And this is another useful chart because it shows you the differences in germination time. This is in days, depending on soil temperature. So, you know, for example, you know, if you look at tomatoes, you know, if you planted them now, if they germinated at all, it would be like a month outside. But, you know, if you germinate them inside in heat, they're going to be up in like less than a week. Okay. Similarly, beans, you know, if you wait until your soil is nice and warm, then beans are going to be up in a week and so forth. So really does make a difference when you know, when you plant with your soil temperature. Okay, we're at a break point. Maggie, questions?
Yeah. Yes, we have some left from the last time. I don't think we can take all of them, but there was one question about, there was one couple about raised beds. One is there any reason why you can't use concrete for a raised bed?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. And then someone else comments that they understand that pressure treated wood no longer uses heavy metals like arsenic to treat the wood.
I think that is true, but I don't know what they are using. So just do your research on it.
Okay.
The other thing I would say is there is, you know, now there's plastic wood out there. And again, I ought to know this, but don't. I just don't know like what might leach out of that. Just do your research.
We have a couple questions about insects, but I think you're
We'll
going
get to that,
right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll hold those. Someone would like to know if you've found a good way to shade bell peppers, and also a similar question about preventing sun scald on tomatoes in very hot areas.
Well, there is shade cloth. There's something called shade cloth. So just go look that up, and that's designed for this, you know, use.
There are different types of it, like how much, depending on how much light you want to filter, right? Because there's some that'll block 50%, some that'll block 80%. So you have to decide.
You have to find that mix where you're still photosynthesizing,
Right.
but you are shading the plant. And with tomatoes, one thing I've seen is if you don't have enough leaf growth in the tomato, those tomatoes, the fruits are going to be more exposed and more liable to sunburn.
And also trellising them properly
Yes.
will help too, to make sure they're protected. Someone would like to know if you can plant nasturtiums with vegetables.
So I'm gonna get that get to that with partnering, but the answer is absolutely. I've had some good luck with nasturtiums.
Okay. Let's see. There's another question about squirrels, but I think you're going to be getting to that sort of thing.
My favorite.
Your favorite.
We'll
I know
get to those.
Your favorite. Okay. Let's see. There's another bug question. And I think someone would like to know what hybrid tomatoes you like. Pardon me. I don't know if you answered that or not.
Yeah. So Sun Gold is my absolute favorite cherry, and it is that of a lot of people. We sell a lot of Sun Golds at our spring seedling sale, and Sun Gold is actually a hybrid. And a lot of people love early girls, and early girls are hybrid, and then there's various, spin-offs of early girls.
Okay, let's see, what else are we at here? This person says they have some Jimmy Nardello pepper seeds that were saved from last year. When should they be started? So check the chart, right?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to, in a few slides, show you our planting calendars, which you'll be able to go to our website and download.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. Someone would like to know if it's too early to plant basil and other heat-loving.
Absolutely, yeah. Basil are really, really heat-loving. So I've started my basil indoors with my tomatoes. So they're indoors. They're about this high. They're going to go out when the tomatoes go out. They want the heat.
Here's a question about soil temperature. When is the best time to check the temperature? Should it be midday, later in the day?
I would check it a few times a day.
Okay.
Yeah. Obviously, it's gonna heat up throughout the day, but you do want to sort of understand what it is first thing in the morning, which is going to be the coldest time.
Okay. Someone would like to know if it's too late to start tomatoes from seed indoors.
No. Think, roughly 8 weeks to transplant. So, what would that would take you to mid-May. No, it's not too late at all.
Okay. I think, except for the questions about bugs, which we'll be getting to, that kind of it's in a good spot to move on.
Yep, there's always lots of questions about bugs.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about our microclimates here. Not that you need to understand it in immense detail, but we have wide variations in climate in our area. I was talking to Paula before we started the call, and are you in the fog belt of Pacifica or the warm belt of Pacifica? Because there's differences even within Pacifica. So these are the famous sunset climate zones that are still pretty good. And basically the basic message is the closer you are to the cool marine air, which we get on our summer afternoons here, then the cooler your weather is going to be, and that's going to limit what you can grow. Okay. And the further away you are from that cool marine air, the warmer it's going to be on an afternoon. So where do we find that? So pretty much the whole coast side, but again, not all of the coast side, inland for like a mile or so. that's going to get, a lot of the cool air and fog. And remember that it's not just the temperature, but also the fog blocks the sunlight and reduces the photosynthesis, okay? San Francisco has microclimates, which I'll show you in a second, but the cool air comes into the bay and then comes down. So, I live, in sort of the reasonably close to the bay in Menlo Park. And in the summer afternoons, the wind always comes down this way, right? Because that cold air is coming in this way and blowing down. And so even alongside the bay shore, you're going to get some effect of that cool air. If you cross the bay, again, you're going to see a belt close to the bay that's very much influenced by the cool air and the fog. And then as you get away from the bay, it gets warmer and warmer. And of course, once you get over the hills to Livermore and the Tri-Valley, it gets downright hot. So within San Francisco, roughly speaking, you can draw a line down the middle. And the coastal and the fog belt is going to be the Outer Richmond, the Presidio, all the Sunset District, down to Daly City, et cetera, et cetera. The Sun Belt within San Francisco, it's surprising what you can grow over on the east side of San Francisco. This would be Mission, Potrero Hill, southern parts of the city and here as well. So if you're in the city, you absolutely have to get Golden Gate gardening. They actually break this down into 7 different microclimates. This is just, I'm a weather geek. And so this is a snapshot from the National Weather Service. It was a typical summer day last summer. And this just shows you the spread in temperature. So these are the measurements at weather stations around the Bay Area, and the numbers represent the temperature. The little lines represent wind speed and direction. And so you can see the coast side's in the 60s, right? And San Francisco, is like, in the low 60s, and the wind's blowing through the Golden Gate, et cetera. Along the bay here, we're kind of in the 70s here. Similarly along the bay side across the bay. But then as you get away from the bay, sheltered by the hills here, it's in the 80s. And I can get in my car on a summer afternoon, 4 o'clock, drive across Menlo Park, or even more into like Atherton or Woodside, and there's a 10-degree difference, okay? So if you're trying to grow eggplants, tomatoes, peppers, that's a big difference, okay? So I actually kind of gave up on growing eggplants at home because I just didn't have the heat. Similarly with peppers. If you are going to grow tomatoes, then you want to think about what varieties you can grow, because some varieties deal much better with cooler temperatures than others. And again, at our spring seedling sale, we have varieties of tomatoes that are, specifically bred for the coastal climate and for cooler conditions. On the other hand, if you want to grow cruciferous vegetables and leafy greens, then the coast side is your place. You can grow them like crazy over there. And, little known fact that San Mateo County grows 50% of the Brussels sprouts for the entire United States.
Wow.
All right, so here are the planting calendars. So you'll see here it says hot southern area of San Mateo County. So Carol O'Donnell, who's, my master gardener guru for growing vegetables, she put together 3 planting calendars for what we call hot southern area of San Mateo County, okay? And then foggy areas of San Francisco and coastal San Mateo. And then we have a third, which I haven't shown here, but it's called sunny, okay? Which is kind of in between. And if you go back up here, you know, foggy is going to be the coast side and western San Francisco. Sun, hot, that's in air quotes, is going to be kind of, you know, Menlo Park, Redwood City, San Carlos, probably, I would say there. And then sunny is kind of everything in between, you know, San Mateo is sort of smack in that mid-range area. But go to the website. I've got the URL here, and you can download these on your own. So if you look at what you can plant now in March, S stands for seed, T stands for transplant. Okay, from seed you can pretty much plant any leafy green or any root crop. Okay, you can plant cruciferous vegetables, but with transplants. Okay, as I said, you generally want to plant cruciferous vegetables from transplants anyhow, and not from seed. The one exception to that is kale, which grows from seed pretty well. Okay, and that's about it for now. It's too early to plant your warm weather crops. Those are your eggplant and tomatoes and your beans and you know, corn and so forth. You know, when I started as master gardener, the perceived wisdom was May 1st was the day for putting your tomatoes and warm weather crops in the ground. I would say since then it's moved to at least April 15th, just because our climate's getting warmer. And our spring seedling sale is April 9th this year. You've got a week to harden off those vegetables. So mid-April is kind of the time you know, now for putting your warm weather crops in the ground. In the foggy areas, there's really not much difference at this time of year. It diverges in other times of the year. You'll see this list is actually longer than the sunny area, the hotter areas at this point. And that's because the closer you are to the ocean or the bay, your summers are cooler, but your winters are warmer because of the moderating influence of the ocean air. So your soil doesn't get as cold during the winter. So you can actually plant a little more sooner if you're in the foggy areas. So I'm not going to go through these in detail, but definitely, you know, go to the website and get whatever one applies to you. So let's talk about starting seeds indoors. As I said, you got to plan 6 to 8 weeks until transplants. So I've got some, you know, some props here that I can show you. So here's a seed starting tray, right? It doesn't have any holes in it. Okay, so it keeps the water in there. You can either put your soil in this tray, or what I do is, because I have a million of these you know, 4-inch pots from seedlings that I bought at the garden store, I fill those with a planting mix and I just set them into the tray. And I can fit 18 of these in a tray at one time. If you do start seeds directly in the planting tray, at some point you're going to need to what we call up pot those, and that is move them to their own 4-inch pots. So I just go straight into the 4-inch pots. So first of all, if you reuse pots, which I do, and the same is going to apply to growing in containers, you need to disinfect them first so that you get any diseases out of there. So do a 10% bleach solution, wash them out, rinse them, and then you're good to go. Okay, now these, you know, these pots have holes in the bottom. Okay, so the water is going to go, these are going to sit in, you're going to fill the tray with water. This is going to sit in the tray and the water is going to be absorbed through the bottom of the pot into the soil. Okay, you need to use a seed starting medium. Okay, that's not the same as potting soil. Okay, it's either called seed starting or planting mix. Okay, so planting mix and potting mix are different. You'll find that planting mix is a much lighter weight mix that's much easier for seeds to sprout with. Okay, so you mix it up in a big bucket, get it moist, then ladle it into your tray or into the pots. Need to keep them warm. I didn't bring in here my my heating mat, but they sell heating mats which are the same size as those trays. And you set the tray on the heating mat, you plug the heating mat into an outlet, and it's going to keep that tray at a good solid 75 degrees, which is just the right temperature that your seeds need to start. You're then going to want to cover the tray to keep the moisture and the heat inside. You can buy a kit which comes with all of this stuff. I just have some extra plastic that I just, loop over and tuck in. And then the last point is, I've made this mistake: label your pots, because, in a week, these things are going to pop up and you're going to go, what's that? What did I plant? So make sure you label your pots, particularly if you're planting like multiple varieties of tomatoes, right? How do you know which are the green zebras versus the black crims and all that good stuff? So once they've germinated, then remove the plastic top, because what they need now is not heat. Okay, they need the heat to germinate. Now they need light. So you can unplug the mat, and now the seedlings need to get light. The best thing is for them to get natural light. So if you've got like, a window or a sliding glass door or something that's getting a decent amount of direct sunlight, that's the best thing for them. But if you don't have that, you can use fluorescence. Just remember that plants absorb light at the extremes of the spectrum, the blue end and the red end of the rainbow. And the reason plants look green is because they're reflecting that part of the spectrum, which is in the middle. So you can get a cool and a warm fluorescent and do that. They also have what they call grow lights, which are going to give you a broad spectrum of light. Here's an important point. You need to provide air circulation, okay? So if they're indoors, it's good to get a fan and turn that on a low speed and just keep them moving around. That helps thicken up the stems. Let them sleep at night. Plants sleep at night. They're not made to get 24 hours of light. So if you have them under a grow light, turn it off at night. And then eventually you're going to trim them back to one plant per pot using scissors, because you don't want too many plants in there drawing out all the nutrients. Okay. And I think that's good enough. So why don't we break here for questions?
Okay. Someone would like to know how you avoid overwatering the seedlings if you're watering from below.
Yeah, that's a great question. So overwatering can be a problem because it can make the seedlings a little bit weak and wobbly and kind of leggy. So basically, it's, you need to have some level of water in there so that the pots are absorbing it. But just check the soil. If the soil is feeling really damp, then cut back the watering. If it feels completely dry, then add more water.
Maybe you could explain why watering from below is important versus, like showering from above.
Yeah, we'll talk about that with irrigation.
Okay.
But basically, vegetables want water at their roots. They don't want them on the leaves. And in fact, the water on the leaves can be a place where diseases form.
Someone would like to know if you can use LED lamps or lights for your growing.
Yeah, absolutely. Just again, make sure you get them at the ends of the spectrum. So even LEDs like fluorescents, some are quote unquote warm, which are redder, and some are cool, which are bluer. So get like a few at the extremes.
So a combination?
Combination, yes.
Okay, great. There's a question that is related to raised beds, but it's a quick one, I think. Someone wants to know if you can use wooden wine boxes for raised beds for lettuces.
Wooden wine boxes like wine barrels. Sure.
I think the boxes is what they're talking about. Like you might like
Oh,
a
yeah,
European wine box kind of.
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
Mhm.
Seems like, yeah, that would work
Okay.
fine. Yeah.
Okay. Now another question is, how deep does the dirt need to be? And it, for vegetables, for seeding vegetables.
Oh, for seeding vegetables,
Mhm.
not deep at all. I mean, you can see this pot is 3 inches deep. Okay, by the time the root is getting down to the bottom of this, you're gonna transplant it.
So maybe like an inch down to plant the seed, something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends. I mean, various seeds have different planting depths. The deepest are like the beans, which are an inch deep. Most are like 1/4 to 1/2 inch.
Okay.
Deep. Yeah, but then you're going to want some soil beneath that for the roots to go down.
Someone would like to know what damping off means.
I don't have a good answer for that. I should know that, and I don't.
It's not the same as hardening, I don't believe.
No.
Okay.
Maybe someone if someone in our audience knows that, they can put it in the chat.
Okay. This person says that they started their tomatoes too early and they're outgrowing the indoor space now. Is it better to transplant them outside earlier or move to a less sunny indoor location?
Yeah, I mean, I've done that not with tomatoes, but like I started some zucchini, and like after a few weeks, these things were like, enormous, and I'm like, okay, now what do I do? I would say, put them outside. You're taking a risk, but there are things you can do to keep them warmer outside. Okay, you can put them under a cold frame. You can put you can put an agribon or on top, which I'll show you when I get to pest control. So I would say you're pretty much restricted to putting them outdoors and maybe trying to keep it a little warmer.
So someone in our audience has sent a message that with regard to damping off, and apparently the definition is it's when seedlings die when they have not been taken care of properly. That's
got it. Okay.
Might be the definition. Okay. And that does it for that group.
Yep. So let's keep moving then. So thinning. Just remember, this is something you have to do. If you plant from seed, particularly if you're planting like lettuce or something with teeny tiny seeds, you're going to get way more plants than you need, and you need to thin those out. Okay, otherwise they'll be competing for the same soil, and you won't get healthy plants. They won't develop full-size leaves and so forth. So every seed packet tells you the growing distance between plants, and you should respect that. So if they say plants should be 6 inches apart, then you're going to need to thin everything in between to 6 inches apart. Thinning takes a ton of time. It's really boring, and there's just no way around it. The one thing I would say is, when you thin those greens, those lettuce or mustard greens or whatever, don't throw them in the composter. Those things are called microgreens, and they're great to eat. They make for great salads. So plan on thinning, okay? sunlight requirements for leaf or root vegetables, generally 6+ hours per day. Fruiting vegetables are going to require at least 8. So tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, zucchini, etc. They need at least 8 hours per day. So find the sunniest spot in your yard. Southwest exposure is generally going to be the best, but you need to look at where the trees are and fences and stuff like that. Warm weather vegetables. So we give you instructions when you buy tomatoes at our seedling sale. But generally when you plant a tomato, you want like 1/3 or 1/2 of the root to be, 1/3 or 1/2 of the stem to be underground. Okay, you want to plant them really deep. And that's to establish good root growth. This is particularly true with tomatoes because they're a particularly deep-rooted vegetable. But some of the other warm weather vegetables, peppers, eggplants, are similar. Okay, follow those spacing guidelines. Okay, there's a reason they tell you that things need to be a certain distance apart, and that is because when that thing grows up, it's going to be an awful lot bigger than it was when you transplanted it in there. Okay, so follow the spacing guidelines. This photo, I love this photo. I found it on the internet. This is what happens when you plant a sun gold tomato and you don't prune it. Sun golds are notoriously vigorous growers and just grow massive numbers of stems. And if you don't keep on it, you end up with something of this size. So, when you planted that thing, it was this big, right? But you have to be thinking about how big it's going to be eventually. And, to get to the question of powdery mildew on zucchini, there's some good videos out there. Powdery mildew is a fungus. It's an airborne fungus. And once it gets on your zucchini plant, it'll just go everywhere. And the leaves get this powdery white color from the fungus and they die. You have to pull them off and pretty soon you've lost the plant. The best resistance to powdery mildew is to make sure that your zucchini are not too close together so that you can get proper air circulation between plants. Because if you have good air circulation, that's going to prevent the fungus from settling on the leaves. So if you have zucchini that are too close together and the leaves are all intertwined, that's where you're going to get powdery mildew. Okay, so that's a good reason to follow the spacing guidelines. Soil temperature must be at least 55 to plant your warm weather vegetables. And most are going to be heavy feeders. So you're going to want to just give them a dose of regular organic fertilizer every 2 to 4 weeks. Okay, we talked about companion planting. There's a great book that came out recently called Plant Partners. Look it up. A lot of the companion planting stuff is folklore, okay? And this book, Plant Partners, is actually the first one to sort of look at the scientific literature. And a lot of the folklore turns out to be just folklore. And, I was always taught plant marigolds by the tomatoes to deter pests. Well, there's absolutely no evidence for that. But there are some things that seem to work well together. One interesting one is the corn bean squash trio, which has traditionally been grown by Native Americans. And there's actually good scientific reasons why this combination works well together, okay? Lettuce goes well with carrots and radishes. Lettuce is very shallow rooted and carrots and radishes are deep rooted. So if you do them in sort of alternating rows, it's sort of a nice combination. I don't know why, but tomatoes, onions, and basil seem to go well together, particularly tomatoes and basil. I always plant mine in the same bed. And then you need pollinators for your cucurbits. So again, your cucumbers and your squash and your melons, they need pollinators. Okay, they have male and female flowers, and somebody needs to take the pollen from the male to the female flower. Tomatoes and eggplants don't need that. They're self-pollinating. The same flower has male and female. You actually need air circulation for pollination to occur. But you need pollinators at your cucurbits. So I have a lot of perennials, flowering perennials that I grow near my cucurbits to try to attract pollinators. And by the way, most of the pollinators that we have here in our backyards are not commercial honeybees. They're wild bees, which are great pollinators. So there was the question before about nasturtium. Here's a picture of nasturtiums. And I switched over to nasturtium in some of my beds and had really good luck with it. You know, one of the things about living in the Bay Area is that most of us don't have big yards. So how do you make the best of small spaces? Well, you can grow up, okay? This is a wonderful variety of summer squash called Trombetta, which means trumpet in Italian. And you can see why it's got that name, because it kind of looks like a big trumpet. And you can actually trellis it. Plus, it looks really cool. And tastes quite good as well. If you know, things like squash that are going to be big and sprawly, just plant them at the corners of your bed and let them sprawl out of the bed. Now you've then got the issue of keeping the critters away from those, and that's a different issue, but that's another thing you can do. Or, you know, you can plant your shade-loving plants beneath your taller plants, and you can keep your tallest plants at the end of the bed so they don't block the sun for the smaller plants. Okay, let's talk about containers. So you need at least a 5-gallon container or larger for tomatoes and squash. The next page, which I'm not going to go through, this is an excerpt from Golden Gate Gardening, where Pam Pierce talks about how deep a container should be. And you can see that, for tomatoes, you're really looking at like, you need up to 18 inches because they're very, very deep rooted. But also, beans, cukes, eggplants, peppers, etc. So you need a pretty deep container for tomatoes. Now, there are different varieties of tomatoes, and some tomatoes, like an early girl, are just a smaller, more compact tomato. They can go into a slightly smaller container. I grow my green zebras, which are a relatively compact plant in containers. But my sun golds just need a lot of space. So as always, wash your containers beforehand in bleach. Again, invest in a good organic potting soil. Don't just take your backyard soil and dump it in a pot. That's not going to be a good idea for growing your vegetables. You don't need to empty it every year unless the plant had diseases the previous year, in which case you should. But you can maintain that soil in a container. You just need to replenish it. Okay, so just like your raised bed, add some compost, add some organic fertilizer, and mix it up real well. A good rule of thumb is to maybe take out 1/3 to 1/2 of the potting soil each year. You can put that in your compost pile. You can put it anywhere in your yard, and then replenish that with new soil, compost, and fertilizer. Now, just remember that in a container versus a big bed, the water and nutrients are going to get used up more quickly. Okay, so you need to be conscious of that and maintain adequate moisture in them. You're going to need to fertilize a little more frequently. Particularly ceramic pots are going to heat up on hot days, so you need to pay attention to them. And if your plants look droopy, give them some water. Definitely mulch in your containers, just like you would mulch in the bed. That reduces evaporation. As I said before, vegetables want to be watered at soil level, not from above. So I take a drip line out of my raised bed and run it over to the container, which is next to the bed. And that way I have it on a timer and I don't need to worry about it. Harvesting. Plan on spending about a third of your time harvesting. Remember that some vegetables, you actually need to continue harvesting for them to keep producing. So for example, you've all seen it if you grow zucchini, like you forget about the one zucchini and it grows to be the size of a baseball bat. Well, the plant is putting all its energy into that one zucchini, which means you're not growing more zucchini, okay? So you need to harvest zucchini, you need to harvest beans to keep that plant producing new fruit, okay? And then another thing to think about is to do successive plantings of shorter crops so that you keep harvesting throughout the season. Like if you plant 10 lettuce plants, so first of all, with my leafy greens, I don't harvest the whole plant. I just pick from the outer leaves and then it just keeps on going. But something like lettuce, you can plant every few weeks and then you always have lettuce. It's not like you have lettuce and then you don't have lettuce for several weeks while you're waiting for your new crop. So this is where the planning becomes important, sort of thinking ahead 6 to 8 weeks and continually planting so that you have successive crops. And this photo isn't it? This is, you can sort of see in this photo, I had Swiss chard growing in this bed. And then while the Swiss chard was still, growing well and harvesting, I planted my pole beans in rows in between the Swiss chard. And then the pole beans come up, and as long as they're getting enough light, they'll grow up. And then when the chard starts to fade away, then I've got beans, okay? So this is a slightly better photograph. You can see here, I've got a bed of mustard greens, and then I've dug out rows in between them where I'm gonna plant some new greens that'll be just a few weeks behind those mustard greens. Okay, so I'll stop there before we get to sort of the miscellaneous topics. I know everyone wants to get to pest control, so we need to make sure we set aside time for that.
Okay, just a little time check here. We are at 5:30. We have a number of people who don't mind staying, so
Okay,
just
great.
FYI. Okay, a couple of quick questions. One is with regard to the book that you mentioned on companion planting. Is that Plant Partners by Jessica Walliser?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let's see. Several people asked about that. Okay, we have one person who would like to know what your opinion is on pruning the tops of indeterminate tomatoes so they don't grow like the one in the photo.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly, like a sun gold, if you've ever grown sun golds, they'll grow to 12 feet tall if you let them. So unless you want to harvest from a ladder or you can't support them up to 12 feet, then by all means, tomato plants grow what they call suckers, right? You have a stem, you have a leaf, and then at 45 degrees, there's what's called a sucker. And if that thing is left to develop, it will become a new stem, which will grow leaves and tomatoes and more suckers, right? And different varieties are more or less prone to this. And sun gold is probably the most prone to this. So I find if I don't start clearing out the suckers early from the sun golds, it just gets way too thick and you don't get enough sunlight into the plant. So that, sorry, that's how you manage tomatoes. Most tomatoes, generally, by managing the suckers. But yeah, if it's going to be a really too tall tomato, then just you can top it off and it'll just grow from the sides.
Question about watering plants in containers. This person says that she sometimes has problems with the water just draining out and not wetting the soil. How do you prevent that?
Well, that would suggest to me that your soil's too porous because the water is just going through like sand. A good soil is going to retain the water adequately. So I would pay attention to what soil you've got in there.
Great. All right, we can move on to bugs.
Okay, all right. But first we're gonna get to irrigation. So for irrigation, my advice is drip, drip, drip. Okay, why? Number one, as I said, you want water going to the soil and not to the leaves. You can actually create diseases, like, particularly with tomatoes, when you get water on the leaves. This is why a lot of people will actually pinch off the tomato leaves up to a good 3-4 inches in height, okay, to prevent anything from splashing up there and getting on those leaves and leading to an infestation. So one, for the health of the plant, drip irrigation is best. Two, if you water from above, like with a hand sprayer, as much as 50% of that water is being evaporated while you're doing it. You don't realize it, but it's just going up, and particularly on a dry day. So drip is much better. The Israelis invented drip irrigation. They still make the best drip irrigation. It is a lot of work. So there is downside to it, but I find it's a worthwhile investment. They tend to clog up and you need to, clear them out, replace them occasionally, etc. One important thing is if you're building new beds, make sure you have a water source by the bed, okay? Somewhere that you can then, run some pipe for some drip irrigation or connect a hose and spray it, but make sure you have a water source wherever you build your raised beds, okay? Always best to irrigate early in the morning, before sunrise to reduce evaporation. Water needs change over the life cycle of a plant. So when you're germinating, you need to keep the soil moist. We talked about that, germinating indoors, the same goes outdoors. And then if you've just transplanted also, they have higher moisture needs because they're trying to establish roots. And then when they're fruiting, okay, they're, trying to put most vegetables are like mostly water, like a cucumber is 95% water or something. So when they're fruiting, they need a lot of water too. Tomatoes, you actually want to start cutting back on the water later in the season. But then there are just a whole bunch of other factors to consider. If you've mulched, you don't need to water as much. Depends on the humidity and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've included this slide here. I'm not going to go through it, but basically, if you go to UC Davis and you look up, like, how much water should I put on my vegetables? It's all designed for the giant agribusinesses in the Central Valley. And they'll tell you and it's all designed for flood irrigation, which is a terrible form of irrigation. And they'll say something like, well, you need 1 to 2 inches a week. Well, what does that mean? In terms of how long I should turn the timer on for my vegetables. So I've done the math for you here. You can look at this. And the bottom line is, do a visual check. Droopy plants need more water. A good guideline is when you're starting out in the season, maybe water 3 days a week. As you get later in the season, maybe go 2 days a week. But less frequent, deeper waterings are better than like watering every day for a short period of time. Okay. And basically for like a 4x8 bed, you know, you're looking at, with drip irrigation, 1.5 to 2 hours of irrigation a week. But like we could do a whole class on irrigation. Okay, integrated pest management. This is a discipline that we teach. I'm just going to switch over to show you the UC website. Hang on. Okay, I'm not finding it, so I'm just going to go back to my my presentation. But go to this website, ipm.ucanr.edu. That's UC Agricultural and Natural Resources. It's a great website. You can search by pest, you can search by plant, and they tell you how to diagnose anything, and then how to treat it, and so forth. The other thing is at the very end of the presentation, we tell you how to get in touch with our Master Gardeners helpline. You can send us an email anytime, enclose a photograph of what your problem is, and the Master Gardeners will diagnose it for you. And if we don't know the answer, we go to UC Davis and get their expertise. So, you know, use that free resource of, you know, if you got a problem, you don't know how to solve it, we call it Ask a Master Gardener. So there's 5 steps to integrated pest management. Monitor for pests, identify what you got. Once you figure out what you got, how do I deal with it? You know, how do I change the habitat? So for example, you got snails and slugs. Make sure there's no spaces close to your raised beds where they like to nest. For example, you have rats, same thing. Clear out any areas with debris that are going to be, you know, nice for rats. Population control. When my kids were little, we used to do snail patrol. We'd go out at night with flashlights and we'd pick snails, and they thought it was fun. You know, I was getting free labor. We used to actually graph the number of snails, because so we turned it into a math exercise. I was getting free labor out of the kids. And if you go out and do that for a week, then you've reduced your snail population, and then you don't need to do it for a few more weeks. If you have a rat problem, set rat traps, okay? So that's what population control is. And then biological controls is, you know, think about how nature solves these problems, right? Nature has developed very effective ways to get rid of pests. So plants have their own you know, chemical signals that they send out to deter pests. Part of the plant partner thing is that certain partner plants will keep certain pests away from their partners, okay? You know, other biological controls are things like, you know, ladybugs eat aphids, right? So there are a lot, you just, you know, figure out who's next up in the food chain, and see if they can solve your problem. You know, there's a lot of parasitic wasps, for example, that will you know, eat pests. So, you know, the main thing is if you can keep a healthy ecosystem in your vegetable bed, which starts with the soil, but also includes, you know, having, you know, native plants and perennials nearby, a good population of pollinators, and a general good population of insects, then that's going to prevent a lot of the pests from developing. Okay, it's not to say it's not going to happen, because it absolutely will happen. But you know, that's a start. Okay. Now, one thing I use extensively is floating row covers. So this is a floating row cover here. The most common trade name is Agrobon. It's a woven synthetic fabric, okay? It lets in, you know, like 98% of the sunlight. It even lets in water when rain gets on it. It sort of slowly drips through. But what it does do is it keeps out insects, okay? And it keeps out four-legged critters that want to get into your beds. So for example, over my leafy greens bed here, where you see a lot of chard and greens and stuff like that, I'll keep that covered year round with a floating row cover. And, you know, that'll keep out, you know, the aphids and the beetles and the beet leaf miners, which are a huge problem in Swiss chard. I just don't have those problems when I cover it with floating row covers. I'll also use floating row covers for my seed when I put seeds in and when I put transplants in there, because the birds love those things, okay? And so I'll cover them with floating row covers until they're tall enough that they can sort of live on their own and sort of, you know, they're past the seed stage, so the birds aren't interested. And if the birds want to pick off a leaf or two, it's not going to kill them. Obviously, if you're growing tomatoes, you know, or zucchini or any one of the large vegetable crops, at some point they're going to get too high for the floating row cover, and you'll just take it off. Okay. Last point is about vertebrate pests, which, you know, is sort of a euphemism for squirrels in our area. You know, we all have our squirrel woes. You know, there's so many squirrel videos online, and most of them are totally depressing. I saw a whole presentation from Santa Clara County Master Gardeners that basically said there's nothing you can do for squirrels. Obviously, a floating row cover will keep the squirrels out if your plants are low enough. I've had some luck with an electric fence. So this is an electric fence. You can get all the materials for this online. It's basically powered by 2D batteries here. And then you run this wire, or, you know, you kind of loop it around the bed 3 or 4 times up, you know, up to a few feet in height. And you make it so that the squirrels can't really squeeze through it. It won't kill the squirrels. It just gives them a little shock, which will make them think twice about doing it again. And they seem to get the message. So I do use these, and I've had reasonably good luck with these, but you know, everyone's got their squirrel challenges. Gophers are a whole other challenge, particularly those of you on the coast side. Janice Moody is our master gardener, gopher trapping expert, and I believe she has a video on our website. So just last thing, composting. If you can do your own compost pile, it's great. Not all of us have the space. You need to have a space that, you know, gets some summer heat. You want a combination of, you know, 75% what they call the browns, the carbon, which is pretty much any, you know, any decaying plant. But then you need some nitrogen. This is what makes it heat up and get to a sufficient temperature. So this is where your grass clippings are helpful. Alfalfa meal, and animal manures, as long as you're not using dog or cat. Yeah, you know, absolutely the best compost pile I ever had was when I was in a community garden and we were getting horse manure dumped in there. And boy, that's just wonderful. You just have to allow it sufficient time to break down and become compost. You always want to keep it moist, and turn it occasionally to aerate it. You want to get a compost thermometer, which is just like a soil thermometer, but it's still got a longer probe on it because it's going to go into this big pile. And you're going to want that thing to be at a good 150, 160 degrees for several days in order to get hot enough to break everything down. Okay, so that was kind of a sprint there. You'll get this presentation so you can look at it in more detail. Here are flyers for our spring garden market. We are back in person this April for the first time since 2019. Saturday, April 9th, 9 to 1 at the San Mateo County Event Center. These are all seedlings that have been raised by the master gardeners in our greenhouses up at the event center. We carry some great varieties and they've been grown with love and care. $5 a seedling. So we'd love to see you all come out there and get your tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and so forth. And then a bunch of resources here. And then again, here's the details for if you want to ask a master gardener. So if we have questions and people are willing to hang around, I'm willing to take questions.
We've got a couple here. Someone said that they weren't able to read the brand on the squirrel electric fence barrier. Could you say what it is?
Oh gosh.
Your fence charger?
No, I can't read the I can't read the name on there, but you know, I bought it at a major online retailer who you probably can figure out who it is. And again, so you just have to be careful when you get on there. So a lot of these are designed for like ranches, okay?
Larger animals.
And large animals. You don't need that, going across miles of terrain. You don't need that, right? You can get AC powered ones, but you got to have an AC source out there. I don't, and I don't want to run a plug, a power cord across there. So I like the DC powered ones there, but you can buy the charger, you can buy the wire, and you can even buy the stakes there. I do want to just mention there was at least one question about deer that came in before today. Deer are hard. Deer can jump 8 feet, right? If you've got deer, what I see are people do totally enclosed spaces for deer, like, walls and roof, caged in. You can do a deer fence. You go look it up online. It's not trivial. Deer are massive eaters. And where you have deer, it's a big challenge.
Okay, so we have one question is about harvesting, and someone would like to know when do you harvest beets or carrots? How do you know when they're ready to go?
I don't have a good answer for that. I poke my finger underground.
Maybe pull one up and see what you think.
Right? Yeah. With potatoes give you a sign, right? The leaves just flop over, dead. Okay, but carrots and beets won't do that. So you'll need to do some exploration on your own and maybe waste one or two, but it'll be really good to eat.
An irrigation question. Someone would like to know what your opinion is of drip tape versus hoses and drip lines.
I don't know drip tape that well. I think it works. It works fairly well. I don't know if that's like the Netafim that the person's referring to. Netafim is the Israeli inventor of drip irrigation, and they make a very good, very high-end drip line. Harvesting did remind me, I didn't talk about time of day for harvesting. Particularly with your greens, you want to harvest early in the day, in the cool, okay? Once the sun hits them, they're gonna kind of get droopy. So you definitely want to harvest early in the day, particularly with your leafy greens.
We have some active shoppers online here, and the brand appears to be Garden and Pet Electric Fence Energizer, and there's one called Phi Shock Garden and Pet Energizer.
That's the one I have.
Energizer. Okay.
I have the Phi Shock, and it's lasted a good number of years.
Yeah,
actually, yeah.
And that apparently it is available through Lowe's, and the person has sent a link. I don't think everybody can see that, but
okay.
But if you go into Lowe's, you can probably find it. Also, okay, so I think you may have already answered this question, but just to be sure, a person wants to know if marigolds planted in the beds are good for pest management.
Well, so I mentioned that in the plan, in the companion planning segment.
Yeah,
I learned that, very early on in my gardening career. And in Plant Partners, Jessica Walliser says there's basically no scientific basis for that. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to work, right? I did the marigold thing for years and my tomatoes were okay. So who am I to say that it doesn't work, right? And hey, marigolds look nice and some people like the smell. So if marigolds are working for you, plant marigolds.
Yeah, can't hurt, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think this might be our last question here. What do you think of directly putting vegetable and fruit scraps straight in the soil, dug down at least a foot or so between growing plants?
Yeah, you can do that. Yeah, I mean, better to compost them and break them down. They're just going to take a longer time to break down, right?
In the decomposing process, when they're in the ground, does it not take up some nitrogen that the plants might require?
Yeah, you're much better off doing a compost pile, I would say. And then of course the other thing is you absolutely don't want any meat products to be in there, or that's going to attract critters.
Okay, that looks like we've got everything covered.
Okay, well, I just want to thank everybody. I hope that was useful. You will be getting a PDF of the presentation. I guess there'll be a recording of the presentation available on a private YouTube channel. And don't forget to come to our spring seedling sale on April 9th and ask a master gardener.